sound?
Sounds pretty good on my end. How's it for all of you?
Tremendous experience to share her insights, her tips, and her pointers with all of us. So I could do you justice, Kelly, with a very long intro, but I think that would maybe take time away from you starting to share your good insights with us. So why don't you just take it away?
All right, thank you. Welcome, everybody. I'm going to just share my screen here. I've got a couple of just a couple of slides to focus us and the conversation today. Lacey, were Lacey, you and Paula, were you able to go over any sort of webinar? What did you call it? Protocol? No. Okay. So I want to encourage everybody who's with us today, and thank you, as Paula said. It's great that you're here to ask any questions that you have throughout the presentation. It's not a very long presentation. I actually think we can probably get through this, the content easily in 15 or 20 minutes. So there's lots and lots of time. If you've got any specific questions, you can do a couple of things. One, you can type your question in the chat box. And Lacey, where do they find the chat box on their screen?
You should be able to see the chat function at the bottom of your screen. It's the little message bubble. And then once you hit chat, it will pop up a little pop out, and you'll have the option to send a message to everyone or to an individual person.
You can also, I think there's a way you can raise your hand in the chat box, and Lacey's going to be monitoring it. I also want to encourage just a conversation, and so if you'd rather ask your question live, then your hand, and Lacey will know that you want to jump in with a question. I think it looks like everybody is muted, which is good. That doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you. It just means that it cuts out the background noise in the webinar, in the recording, and then just unmute when you want to talk. So thank you, Paula, for inviting me to share this webinar with folks. We're recording it today, so it'll be available indefinitely for anybody in our community who would like to access it. I'd like to just kind of talk about some simple goals for the webinar. First of all, this might sound weird, but one of the goals I have is to normalize crisis, to normalize crises, I should say, the plural. Secondly, I want to just develop with you a framework for responding to any crisis that you face at any point in your leadership. And then finally, share just a couple simple tips for forming a crisis response team. I appreciated Paula's introduction and also her description of this webinar as being Kelly Fryer sharing her experience responding so well to crises. Well, most of what I've really learned has come, as I've learned as much from all the messes as I have from the things that have gone well. And I have had a lot of messes over the last 30 years. I think where I want to start is with my first week in my career as a leader. And this is going way, way back. And that picture that you see looks a lot like the person that I had to deal with. So I was 25 years old. I was a brand new pastor, just graduated from seminary, and sent out to pastor this little tiny church out in the country. It was an open country church, they called it. So it sat at a crossroads out in the middle of Illinois farmland. The only thing on the corner, within miles, was this church with this big white steeple and a hand pulled bell and clapboard, and the parsonage, which was on the opposite corner, which is where I was living. And it was the first Saturday night worship service that I was leading on my own as a pastor. And before the service, I had asked the ushers if when people came in, they would just encourage people to go sit up in the front of the sanctuary, because I knew that there were only a handful of folks that came to the worship service, and I knew that I'd been told that they all tended to sit way in the back, which was a long way from where I was going to be. And I just, it's a Saturday night, it's a little bit casual, just ask everybody to come on up to the front. I have a sort of an informal style. And when it came time for me to go over to the church to lead this first worship service, I left the parsonage, walking across the crossroads, up the steps of the church, and out come this older couple with canes. Let's call them Arlo and Imelda. Those weren't their names, but they were probably both in their 80s. And I am not even kidding you. They came racing out of the church doors at me, swinging their canes, screaming, "You're wrecking our church. We're not going to go sit in the, why won't you let us sit in our," I don't even know what they were saying, but they were really angry because I had just, I guess I just want to say, welcome to leadership. Like, if you are in a leadership role, you are going to encounter crisis after crisis. And this did actually become a crisis in this congregation. Arlo and Imelda did not come back to worship until about 4 years later, when I was called to a different congregation. It was a big conflict. And I remember being shocked. But now as I look back on it, I actually think in some ways, this is the definition of leadership. And that is that you are called to deal with the crises in your organizations. And, what I've learned is that sometimes you create the crisis, sometimes you don't. To be a leader is to be a change agent, right? If you're, just think about like the definition of leader. If you're leading, there are people following, and where are you leading them? You're leading them into new places, right? And that creates change, and that inevitably creates conflict, and sometimes it can create a crisis. So I think there are a whole lot of leadership, of crises that leaders create. Sometimes the crisis is caused by an external circumstance. We are certainly in the middle of one of those right now. I'm kind of curious, Lacey, could you throw up the first poll? I'm curious to know from the folks who are, and can you do that? Yeah, there we go. I'm curious to know, however long it's been that you've been in leadership, how long was it, if you think back, how long was it in your career before you had your first crisis that you had to deal with? Just go ahead and pick one of those answers. Was it in the first year? Was it in the first couple of years? Was it longer? And from your perspective, have most of the crises that you have faced as a leader been caused, at least in part, by you, or caused by external circumstances that you didn't really have any control over? Everybody who's on, go ahead, and Lacey and Paula, I invite you to take the poll too. We'll just give it another couple, maybe another minute or so, give you a chance to think about this. You notice one of the responses I didn't offer was, "Oh, I've never had a crisis," because I know that's not true. All right, another 10 seconds, and then I'm going to end the poll. All right, there we go. Let's share the results here. So it looks like it's how long has it been before you had your crisis? It looks like there's a nice diversity. It looks like a couple of us faced. I don't know if anybody faced a crisis in your first week. That was exciting. But a couple in the first year, a couple in the first couple years, and certainly all of us within the first 5 years. And it's a mix. It looks like most of us have had crises that were sort of a mix of both, caused by external circumstances and and external circumstances. I think the other thing I want to say about crises is that they can be caused both by bad things that happen, and they can also be caused by good things that happen. I think that's a real thing to remember. In your own personal life, if you think about sort of the big milestones, you know, let's say graduating from high school, that's a really good thing that happens in most people's lives. But all of a sudden you're faced with, oh my gosh, what is the rest of my life going to look like? Do I go to school? Do I get a job? You know, what does it look like now to be an adult? Even good things can cause crises. I'm working with a client, a nonprofit organization in Phoenix right now. Their annual budget, operating budget, is about $1 million and a half. Well, last year they won a $10 million contract from the federal government to perform a set of services in Phoenix for a very vulnerable population. That's a really good thing, right? I mean, I think any of us who have sat in that CEO, ED, development director position, we would say, oh my gosh, that's an amazing contract. Well, what's happened is, to do that work, they've had to hire a whole bunch of new people. They've had to bring a whole lot of new volunteers into the organization. The work that they're doing in that community is shifting significantly, which is creating some confusion among people in the neighborhood. Internally, now they're asking the question, who are we? We have all these new people. What is our culture? What are our values? How do we work together? And it's really created, in some ways, a little bit of a crisis that is causing them to work together to respond. So I told you my first goal in this webinar was to normalize crises. I think if you don't walk away with anything else than this today, I hope it's this, that to be a leader is to deal with crisis. And they are caused for all kinds of reasons. And so I don't know about you, but I know that for many years, when I would be like, you know, why is this happening? Why is this crisis happening? Instead of asking, wait a minute, it's normal that we're having a crisis. That's what it means to be a leader, is to have to deal with crises. So instead of asking, why are we in this crisis? I think a more helpful question is, what level crisis are we in? That's a way more helpful question. There are, in fact, at least 3 levels of crisis. There's probably more than this, but this is sort of the big picture. Level 1 is a limited crisis, and I'll go into some detail about that in a minute. Level 2 is more of an issue-driven crisis, and level 3 is a major crisis. Level 1 is any incident, potential or actual. I mean, it doesn't even have to have happened yet. It could just be a potential thing that happens that will not seriously affect the overall functional capacity of your agency, but it does require some degree of action. A good example of that from my own experience is when the roof on your building has a major leak right in the middle of monsoon season, and it makes it difficult to use large parts of your building. That's an example of a limited crisis. It's not going to stop, it's not going to stop the presses. It's not going to make you, send everybody home and work at home, but it does require action. And if it's not dealt with, it could become a level 2 crisis. Level 2 crises are more often, they're issue driven. So it's any issue or situation that will have a negative impact on your organization that could potentially cause severe damage or interruption to your operations. That would be, for example, an operations department that is dysfunctional and doesn't take care of the leak in that roof. And so now your roof caves in and your building is in serious jeopardy. Other issue-driven crises examples would be, for example, let's say one of your major funders completely changes its policies and its way of making grants, and you don't qualify anymore. And so a huge revenue stream is going to go missing. That's an example of an issue-driven crisis that could really cause severe damage to you. Another example would be some kind of a hate crime, for example, that it targets your organization, the population that you're working with, that would really create a potential interruption to your operations. Level 3 is a major crisis. This is an incident posing a major risk to your clients, staff, volunteers, resources. Level 3 crises can develop from situations that began at a level 1 or a level 2. Examples would be a terrorist attack, for example, or a major civil disturbance in, rioting in the streets, or a global pandemic. So, I mean, part of the challenge, I think, as I look back on my years, part of the challenge has been not recognizing when we were actually in a crisis, a level 1 crisis or a level 2 crisis, and not moving fast enough to address that crisis in a systemic, reasoned, kind of planned out way. There's no doubt at this point about what level crisis we're in. We are in a level 3 major crisis. And just in case you're not sure how serious this crisis is, the Alliance of Arizona Nonprofits has been surveying nonprofit organizations across the state of Arizona. And as of yesterday, these are some of their results. 85% of those organizations that reported that their services, programs, operations are being disrupted by COVID-19, and 90% of nonprofits said that they are being impacted. 85% of them reported a decreased revenue due primarily to canceled events and contracts. 61% of nonprofits say their services have been disrupted. Of those that are losing revenue, there's been an average of a 37% loss of revenue so far, with a total impact of a $44 million loss of revenue. That's what's been reported so far as of April 7th. And of those who have reported an increase in expenses, it's been an average of a 22% increase in expenses for a total of $7 million so far. 56% of nonprofits anticipate a high impact on their agency caused by COVID-19. Another 38% say there will be a moderate impact. So we're in a major crisis. Well, take a breath, because we're all in it, which means you're not alone. And I think it's important to note that just because, as I've said, crises are normal for leaders, whether you're in a nonprofit, a for-profit, educational institution, government, just because a crisis is normal for leaders doesn't mean that you have to go it alone. And that's where the idea of a crisis response team comes in. And there are a number of different reasons that you should think about forming one if you haven't already done that. And believe me, it's not too late, because this crisis is expected to go on for months. So reason number one that forming a crisis response team is a good idea. First of all, having a team around you gives you a process for gathering and thinking through and evaluating new information as the crisis goes on. So it's not like you have a crisis moment and then it's over. A crisis lasts over a period of time. And for us, COVID-19, we don't actually know when it's going to end. So having a team in place will give you a regular process for kind of keeping up with what's happening. It'll also help keep you and the other leaders in your agency focused on what really matters. It'll help you focus in on the priority needs of the agency, of your staff, your clients, your donors, your community. Third, it ensures, or at least it helps ensure, that your response as leaders is coordinated across the agency. I know in ordinary times, one of the things that many of us struggle with in the nonprofit sector is having those silos. We have different programs that don't necessarily talk to each other. We have operations and programming and communications, and we're not necessarily very good at working together. Well, in a crisis, it becomes really critical that we coordinate our actions across the agency and we get out of those silos. Fourth, having a team around you can help you as the leader make quicker and better decisions, more informed decisions. And honestly, it can help you manage your own emotional response. Knowing that you have gathered a team of your best thinkers within your organization, your key leaders, that you've organized the team, that you have a plan, that you're meeting on a regular basis, it can help you focus on, all right, we have a plan. We're going to meet here. We've put action steps together. We have a way of holding each other accountable so those things get done. We're doing everything we can do. And it can really help keep the emotions down. And having sat for many, many years in the CEO or executive director seat, you know, I know what it's like to lie awake at night worrying about not being able to make payroll. How do I take care of my staff? How do I keep my volunteers safe? How do I make sure that our clients, our partners in the community are getting what they need? Can be very emotional. So a crisis response team can really help. Now, as you're forming your crisis response team, I think there are 3 questions to keep in mind. Question number 1, what level of crisis are we in? We know what level of crisis we're in right now. There's no doubt about it. We're in level 3. But this is a question to keep front and center, because COVID-19 might be the biggest crisis any of us face in our careers, but it certainly won't be the last. So what level of crisis are we in? That will help you figure out which key functions of my organization are going to be impacted by this crisis. Is it across the board? In a level 3 crisis, yes, it is. But if it's a level 1 crisis, if it's the leaky roof, you know, that begins to limit the various departments in your agency that are going to be impacted. What key functions are going to be impacted by this crisis? And therefore, who should represent each of those functions as a member of the crisis response team? That's who you want to get in the room together. At a level 3, most organizations are going to have a team that includes the CEO, the board chair, the treasurer, and then staff members that are responsible for each of the agency's major functions. You might also want to consider including your attorney, if your organization has one. I hope they do, to include your attorney on this crisis response team, because many of the decisions that you will be making could have legal ramifications. You'll want advice about HR law, for example. You want advice about your responsibility, your accountability to your grant makers, your donors, any municipalities that you might have contracts with. What should a community response, a crisis response team do? Well, the first thing you're going to do with your team once you have them gathered is decide that together. In a level 3 crisis, in a major crisis, these are some of the things, actually this is a pretty exhaustive list of the kinds of things that a crisis response team would be responsible for doing. Depending on the level, of course, there will be different things. But at your very first meeting of that crisis response team, you're going to want to really sit and talk about what is our job together. And it could include things like determining the nature and the scope of the crisis, number 1, protecting the health and safety of the folks in your organization, coordinating a cross-functional agency response, figuring out what programs should be closed and when and under what circumstances they should be resumed. Figuring out how to deploy resources and maybe temporarily assigning staff to perform emergency work, to do different things than they usually do, to coordinate communications, to minimize loss, damage, or disruption to the agency, to take action to procure and allocate necessary resources, like, for example, applying for loans through the SBA, applying for emergency grants through the Community Foundation, the community foundations in Arizona, and other foundations that are offering those. So you're going to want to sit down with your team and make that decision. So finally, this is sort of a sample or a template, I guess you could say, for a crisis response team meeting. At your first meeting, you're going to want to sit down and really talk about what your goals are as a team. But even before you do that, at every single meeting, every single time your crisis response team gets together, I think it's important that you spend time, not a lot of time, maybe a minute per person, but talking about how you're doing. I can share with you, be happy to share with you a sample agenda for a community, for a crisis response team meeting. And to, I really lay out a process for kind of doing that opening section with each other where you're caring for each other. I think about the, when you get on an airplane and the airplane attendants, what are they called? The flight attendants, sorry. It's been so long since I've been on a plane. The flight attendants will run you through the emergency procedures, and they always tell you when those masks drop to put your own mask on first, even before you put it on your child. Because if you can't breathe, you can't help anybody else. And so part of what this crisis response team should do is to make sure that the leaders of the agency are helping each other breathe. Secondly, you're going to look at what are our top priorities today, and is there a fire that needs to be put out, and go through a process of really identify. I think when you go around and you kind of care for each other, you might start to hear what the priorities are and if there's a fire, but you're going to want to go through a process together to identify what are the top 2 or 3 things that need to be addressed right now that are absolutely urgent. If you have to vote on so that you can really narrow the focus of where you need to be addressing your resources and your energy, and you're dealing with the most important things, and you're putting out those fires throughout the period of the crisis. Make sure that as a part of your meeting, you're identifying what are the next steps we can take to address those top priorities, to put those fires out. Just the next steps. This isn't a time to be thinking about, what do we need to be thinking about 6 months from now? This is what next steps do we need to take right now to address these issues, and who is responsible for doing it. Make sure that you've got a secretary who's taking notes, who's noting what those next steps are going to be, what you've agreed on, who has agreed to take responsibility for it. And then finally wrap up every meeting by thinking together about what do we need to be communicating to our stakeholders, to our staff, to our volunteers, to our clients, to our donors and funders. I think, the last thing I just want to say is, easier said than done, but I think we need to just remember that crises come in the life of every leader. More than one. I could probably chart my career back by looking at all of the crises that I've dealt with. Some of them good, some of them I dealt with well, some of them I didn't deal with as well as I wish I could have. Learn from that along the way. Don't be scared of the next crisis, but do be prepared. Whether it's somebody swinging a cane at you, or it's a threat that you can't actually see with the naked eye. There are some more resources. I've got a worksheet posted up on my website to put together a crisis response team, and a template for a meeting, crisis response team meeting agenda. You can find that and some other resources on my website. Anybody have any questions, thoughts? What has your experience been with the crisis response team? Lacey, do we have another poll? I think we've got another poll that we could throw up. I can't remember what's on it, but I bet it's really interesting.
Kelly, while we're doing it,
Yeah,
this is
we go.
Paula.
Yeah.
I'm thinking a lot about 2008 and how that really was a level 3 crisis, where where I worked, and
Right.
how our leadership team, which really served as our crisis response team, became so much more cohesive as a result of going through that
Mm,
experience together. And I think,
mm,
you know, that there is a silver lining to this, that people may experience if they really do assemble a team and work hard on their communication and on supporting each other, that the organization will be stronger afterwards.
right. Wow, that's so helpful, Paula. I think that, I mean, I think maybe for a lot of us, it's too soon to hear good
Mhm.
things will come out of this, because it is so terrifying, and because people are, experiencing a real lack of certainty about their job security and so on. But you're right. I mean, as I look back, I have grown more from being in a position of having to lead people through a crisis than anything else that has happened to me in my career. It's been those moments when I have really learned the most. Of course, I think it requires a certain amount of vulnerability to be able to look back and see, wow, I could have done that. I could have done that better. I wish I hadn't said that, or I wish I hadn't done that. But looking at the results of this survey, almost everybody has misidentified the level of crisis that your agency was facing. I think that's super easy to do. I know I've done it, probably more often than I'd like to recognize, and that's why I think that planning ahead, right? Don't go into the next crisis without a plan. Put a crisis response plan in place so that whatever the crisis is, you're ready for it. Do we have another poll there that we could share, Lacey? Just wondering if anybody has been on has experience being on a crisis response team before, and what your experience has been. A lot of the folks that I know in the nonprofit sector who do have experience with being with a crisis response team, they've had that experience in the for-profit sector, not in the nonprofit sector, and they bring that experience into their work. So have you had anybody have no experience? Maybe you've been on one, but it was kind of mixed. Maybe you've had a good experience. Just give that a couple of seconds. I have a little bit of a lag here, so I can't see if everybody's taken it or not. But let's go ahead and end the poll. And so it looks like, in fact, it's pretty evenly split, but more of us have not had experience being on a team or forming one, and a few have had a mixed experience. But interesting, nobody's ever had a good experience. I would say from my perspective, nothing has clarified the need to be prepared more than this experience right now. And it's really been, as I've been, on the phone and on Zoom calls, talking with friends and colleagues and clients in the nonprofit sector. And it's been really tough. It's been a really tough time for folks. So let's let COVID-19 be the beginning of a new commitment in the nonprofit sector to really normalize crisis, to expect it's going to happen, and to be prepared for it when it does. Well, I want to thank everybody for being on with us today. Thank you for the work that you're doing. What you're doing right now, leading your organization through this time, nobody's ever done before. Nobody in our lifetime has ever led through a global pandemic of this magnitude. And so you might have, I've got a friend that calls it monkey mind. I don't know why, but it's that little voice in your head that tells you what you're doing is wrong. Ignore that monkey mind. And if you've got, if you've got folks in your life that are kind of second guessing the decisions you're making, try to just separate that out. And remember, nobody has ever done what you're doing. You're doing a great job. You're doing a great job, but you don't have to do it alone. Put a team together. Let me know if I can help you in any way during this time and beyond. Paula, thank you so much for making this possible. Lacey, thank you for being our technical guru through this. I think we're going to sign off. Does this seem like a good
Kelly,
time?
shall we give people just one more chance if anybody has a question or a comment before we
Oh,
go?
sure.
And
Sure.
I want to do a little commercial plug. 2 weeks
Please
from
do.
today, on the Wednesday at 11 a.m. instead of 12, we're going to have a session on using the technology of Zoom and some of the other sort of human interaction tools that we have in this crisis, because we're all finding that not only in our professional lives we're wanting to connect, but in our personal lives. And there are features in Zoom and some of these other meeting technologies that we don't know how to use. You've shown us today about sharing a screen and about doing polls, and I imagine people haven't always had a chance to even host a meeting yet. And so would invite folks to join us to how to get the most out of these tools at a time when we really want to continue meeting, we want to continue sharing resources and being in touch with each other and supporting each other. So look for that Ask an Expert session on the CFSA website and how to register.
That's awesome. And I just want to thank Paul. I want to thank you and the whole team at the Community Foundation for everything that you're doing to provide resources, financial support, moral support, and just pivoting so quickly. I know you had a whole bunch of things planned, educational events and experiences planned this spring, and you're just pivoting so quickly to bring these things online and to make them available to people. So I just want to thank you for the work that you're doing. Our community is better because you guys are in it.
Thank you. Well, Lacey and I will be sure to share that with our colleagues, because it's a terrific team of people who are doing their best to respond. And we're just in awe of everybody else and how the nonprofit community is really continuing to soldier on during this.
For sure. Thanks everybody for being in this, for sticking in it with your organizations. There's so many people that are depending on the good work that you do. Thanks for being there.
Thanks, Kelly.
And thanks for all of you with your kind words in the chat. We appreciate those too.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Paula, do you want to stay on debrief or anything?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay. Plus Delta. Go. Oh, wait.
I'm just looking at the chat comments because I didn't have that open.
Oh, looks like Kelly's even gone.
We lost Kelly.
We're pretty smooth.
Yeah. I found my own little, inexperience with this. At one point, I tried to look at the list of participants, but then I wasn't sure how to go back to the screen and look at her slides, and I was fumbling with it, and I thought, oh my God, what if I hit the wrong thing as a co-host? Could I shut off the whole Zoom thing? So I was very nervous.
Yeah, I think as long as you don't hit leave meeting or end meeting for all, you're pretty okay.
So you can hit an X and it won't X out the whole thing.
No, like the chat box, you can close those. You can have them go into a pop out mode, or you can close them with the X.
Okay. But I thought you did great with getting the slides up and the polls. And also, did you try to vote? I was having a hard time, and I thought maybe because I was a co-host,
because you're host,
yeah. Yeah. Okay.
That's the function.
They don't want us to pack the ballot box.
Yeah. Don't want to pollute the data.
Yeah.
Oh wait.
But thank you so.
We'll edit
Thanks
that
so
out.
much.